Hi, and good afternoon. Welcome to Montcalm Community College's China and Africa panel discussion. This event is in partnership with the World Affairs Council of West Michigan and is presented as part of the college's ASH Lectureship series. I would like to thank all of you for attending this afternoon's event and would like to provide a generous thank you to our panelists for being willing to share their insights with us. Finally, I want to thank our amazing IT department for setting up the meeting space for us today. My name is Leslie Neal, and I serve as the Communication Faculty and Department Chair here at MCC. I will be your moderator and offer questions to our panel for them to discuss. Our virtual platform allows for you, the audience, to pose questions in the chat. I will keep an eye out for your questions and present them in addition to the ones that I have prepared. Our panelists, Dr. Gerald Nyambane, Dr. Jamie Monson, and Mr. Justin Leggs, all have unique connections to our topic today. In a moment, they will each provide you with a brief greeting and self-introduction. Again, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to pass the virtual microphone to Dr. Nyambane. Dr. Nyambane, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think I was hearing an echo. I apologize if I delayed a little bit. Thank you, Leslie, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for making us be a part of this panel. There's an echo going on, so I'll just continue. I hope you'll get it.
Yes, you're fine. The echo's not. You're fine, Dr. Nyambane. It doesn't sound like an echo coming from our end, but if you'd like us to come back to you, we can do that as well.
Okay, well, why don't you do that as I see what could be happening here?
No problem, no problem. Mr. Leggs, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Hello, my name is Justin Leggs. Hello, my name is Justin Leggs. I am a video editor primarily, and also a historic documentarian. At this point, I've also done equirectangular documentarianism, which is a fancy word for saying that I've done documentary work in 360. I was working in Africa on a couple of different projects that took me across a couple of different areas in East Africa, as well as spent some time in China myself. Very short-lived, but very, very life-changing, in all honesty. And I am very happy to be on this distinguished panel.
Thank you, Justin. Dr. Monson, welcome.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thanks to everyone for having us here and talking about a very important topic. To Justin, who's worked with me on a couple of different projects. I'm the director of the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. I'm also a professor in the Department of History, and my research area of interest is the history of engagement between Africa and China, especially the history of a railway that was built by China in the 1960s and 1970s, the Tazara Railway, which was the topic of a documentary that I produced together with Justin. It's just a pleasure to be here. I'm more of a specialist on the historical dimensions, but can also provide some commentary on the present. I'm an Africanist. I come from a long tradition and history of working in East Africa, and I've also lived and worked in China and been learning Mandarin Chinese for about 10 years now. So working across regions is really what I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monson.
I can come in now?
Perfect, yes.
Oh, okay, I figured it out. It happens that way if you have two windows open to the same conference. I apologize. Now we are all set. So again, thank you, Leslie, for putting this together and for inviting me to this wonderful panel. Thank you for the nice introduction that you gave. My name is Gerald Nyambane, and I am an Interim Dean, College of Arts and Sciences at Davenport University. I'm an ag economist, but I'm interested in international development, and previously I lived in Kenya where I was born, so I have quite some knowledge about Africa. I have quite some understanding of the role of China in Africa, and I would like to share some thoughts with you. I'm very excited to be on this panel with people who have actually been working on a lot of things in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of our panelists. Let's go ahead and get into our first question. Now, like I said earlier as we started, I do have some prepared questions for our panelists, but if you at any time as an audience member have a question that you would like to share, please put it in the chat and I will pose it to our guests. So my first question is posed to Dr. Monson and Dr. Nyambane, and the question is, while history tells us that the continent of Africa has had a relationship with China for centuries, please help us to understand the modern history behind China's investment in the continent of Africa, particularly China's support of Africa's anti-colonial movement in the 1960s. So Dr. Monson, if you would like to begin, and then Dr. Nyambane, if you could also answer this question. Dr. Monson, will you unmute?
There we go. So there are a number of ways that China was engaged in and supportive of anti-colonial movements in Africa. I think one of the ways was through some military aid. There was military aid materially, but also military training for some anti-colonial nationalist struggles. There was also development aid, which is something that I focus on in my own research. And I think sometimes people dismiss the development aid from China at this time because it looks quite small, of course, especially if you compare with the scale of development aid today. But China invested in some strategic and important areas where China, I think, saw its own kind of role model, especially, for example, in rice farming, as a model for development that could provide an alternative to Western ways of doing agricultural development, for example, and other kind of role models, especially during the era of the 1960s with Chairman Mao, values like self-reliance, you know, the idea that people should come together and work hard. China had a number of different values and practices in terms of lifting its own country out of poverty that it hoped to impart to newly developing African countries. And the idea of the role model was very important in the 1960s. And then, so one of the other ways that China really made an effort to support anti-colonial movements was by having delegations and exchanges, what was talked about at the time as friendship between African countries and China, so that members of parties that were nationalists, that were bringing about independence, and especially after independence, were invited to China, not just political delegations, but delegations of farmers and workers, youth, again, to kind of witness the way that China was approaching its own development and to serve as a role model. And of course, all of this going on during the Cold War, when the Chinese role model was explicitly set up as an alternative to a Western development model. So those are some of the ways that China was engaged at that time.
Thank you, Dr. Monson. Dr. Nyambane?
Yeah, thank you. To add on what Dr. Monson has said, if we think about the history of China, the year 1949 was really a turning point. That's the time the Communist Party took over power, the leadership in China, and it outwitted the National Party, which had the support of the West. Now, at that time, the West was, of course, not very pleased that the Communist Party had taken over. Around that time in Africa, many African countries were also fighting for independence. So China found a partner who also has been fighting European imperialism. Therefore, they kind of had a shared experience where they had suffered invasion, plundering of their resources, and enslavement by colonialists, if you like, especially for Africa. So in that sense, the two groups had the same grievances or victimhood, if you like. So that shared sense of struggle and history, then that would engender a sense in which China could now engage in solidarity with Africa in mutual support for development. This saw several new African states, as they attained independence, they established relationship with China. And those that were struggling to fight independence, China then extended moral and material support towards that struggle. They trained military personnel, and this military personnel then became later on very instrumental in driving the independence agenda. But the most important engagement for China at that time was to support hundreds of infrastructural projects, okay, that then would lead to those economies developing. So the main model of China was to support the economy. They sent medical workers, training of military personnel, but they did not offer arms. So if you think of how China approached the fight to independence, it was more training and support and to provide the development projects that then would be helpful to the people who were fighting for independence rather than give guns or troops. So in this sense, their main focus is to use the breadbasket, if you like, approach rather than the guns. Okay. In general, we really see China's approach to international relations being inspired by their legacy of struggling against imperialism. It believes that the best weapon is not against political domination, is through soft diplomacy. So that's what we really saw during that period where China was trying to engage through soft diplomacy and in giving support to those who were fighting for independence and encouraging African leaders to carve their own path of development rather than blindly follow some kind of external recommendation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nyambane. I appreciate both of you sharing this idea of China and Africa coming together because of shared experiences, shared past experiences. And Dr. Nyambane, you talked about the infrastructure and the way that China was willing to invest in the infrastructure in various countries in Africa. And that leads me to my second question. And this is posed to Mr. Leggs and Dr. Monson. China, Tanzania, and Zambia partnered to build a railway that could transport people across borders throughout Africa. In the documentary that Mr. Leggs and Dr. Monson created together, it focuses on the Tazara Railway. Dr. Monson notes in the documentary that this railway brought about a change to the people and the environment in those countries. Can you further expound on some of the notable changes that happened during that time in the 1970s?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Dr. Nyambane, if you don't mind, this is in regards to the documentary that Mr. Legs and Dr. Monson put together, and I will allow you after they share to also share your thoughts on the Tazara Railway.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Leslie. I don't know, Justin, would you like to start or would you like me to start?
I'm sure I can start, and you could just be able to communicate effortlessly, whatever I'm not even able to pick up on. But I can tell you, just having worked on the documentary and cutting everything together, it's very obvious to see the changes on the ground in terms of the people. I think one of the biggest and most notable things for me is the opportunity visually to see African workers given the opportunity to get outside of their home countries and leave and go to a completely new area, studying in China, learning Chinese, becoming mechanical engineers, and then bringing that information, that knowledge back home and just using it to basically make their lives and the lives of everyone that they know, their families, their friends, their lives better. That knowledge then allowing them to serve the betterment of themselves and literally everyone that surrounds them. But not just that, the connections that were made between individuals, the workers that work together side by side, learning, and I'll allow Jamie to go further on in relation to that, the connections that were made, literally, physically, that extended beyond time, that friendships that just couldn't be broken after the fact, and the ties that they're lying within.
Great, thank you, Justin. It might help the audience if I shared a little bit about the railway itself and why it was built. And I think Dr. Nyambane probably can share something about the bigger political context. But this railway was originally dreamed of after independence as a Pan-African railway between Zambia and Tanzania. And at that time, Zambia was landlocked, and all of their copper and valuable minerals had to be shipped south, where white settler governments were still in power. And so after Tanzania's independence, there was this dream of a Pan-African railway that would liberate Zambia from the white settler and colonial regimes to the south and give them an access to the sea, which is to the Indian Ocean at Dar es Salaam. So it was a grand vision that fits into the politics, as Dr. Nyambane has shared, of the time. And in our research, we wanted to look beyond the grand vision and say, how does a big infrastructure project like this really change the lives of everyday people? And we believe that the enduring impact of the railway was at this kind of everyday level. And what Justin's talking about really is the way that there were probably 20,000 Chinese workers that came over to help build this railway in Tanzania and Zambia. And most likely at least twice that number of African workers that worked side by side with Chinese workers. But the process of construction wasn't purely labor, although that was the job, obviously, to build a train, but it was also to provide training and to give expertise, knowledge to those Africans so that after the Chinese left, they could run the railway on their own. So as Justin's talking about, there were 200 African engineering leaders that went to China for further education, and many other ways that people were trained. But the other thing the railway did was it provided a link that people could use to have mobility across the landscape. And people who had been dependent on very challenging marketing infrastructure that either was non-existent or dominated either by not very effective state mechanisms or other problems. Over the next decades, people used that railway to really generate all kinds of livelihoods through their own momentum. So my theme in the work that I do is that it's people who really make trains run. It's the people and the economic activities of the people who use the train that really bring the development. The train doesn't bring development. It's the people who build it, who ride on it, who trade their goods on it, the people who make the railway come to life. That's what we really focused on in our film.
Thank you to the both of you. Dr. Nyambane, I don't want to limit this opportunity to Dr. Monson and Mr. Leggs. Did you have something that you wanted to share as well?
I think they've covered it pretty well.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well then, so Dr. Monson and Mr. Leggs were focused on the 1970s and that relationship that was built through the Tazara railways, but I'd like to jump ahead to the 1990s. And in the 1990s, there was a rapid increase in the engagement between China and Africa. Dr. Monson and Dr. Nyambane talked about the shared experiences that brought this country and continent together. But I'd like for you, both Dr. Monson and Dr. Nyambane, to talk about any notable changes that happened in that relationship between going from this friendship that you spoke of in the 1970s to the increased engagement that started in the 1990s and continues on today. Dr. Nyambane, if you'd like to start.
Okay, thank you. So as we have learned so far is that in the 70s, the relationship between China and Africa was one of partnership, of mutual respect and more or less state-to-state collaboration. But in the 90s, things changed dramatically. Towards the end of the 70s, China made us a switch towards more what we would call a capitalist type of system. Loosely speaking, a market-oriented system from the command economy. This saw them growing economically, and they were enjoying at that time quite some growth in terms of their economy. They began now changing their interest in Africa. They began making foreign direct investments, and those investments now were linked to infrastructure. Okay. At that time, what was happening in Africa in the 90s, many of the African countries were already having pressure to repay debt from the Bretton Woods, the IMF and the World Bank. So they had been subjected to what we call structural adjustment programs. So they were suffering economically. On the other hand, China had all these resources that they had, and they were looking for new markets. So they saw an opportunity rather than just state-to-state partnership. They saw an opportunity to come into Africa in a big way and find a market for their goods. So what they did strategically, they started building roads and ports. That was the first thing they did in order to improve the export efficiency and attract Chinese investors. But all that was linked to any development they brought in. They kind of used this African either ports or whatever thing they did and linked it to the development aid they were giving. Okay. So they began to invest in various industries. They went to invest in the oil industry, but in exchange for infrastructural development. So they own a part of your oil industry, but they don't pay you cash. What they do, they actually build a road or a railway, okay, some kind of infrastructure. So for oil industry, that's what they did in the Sudan, the Niger, Angola, and Gabon, and others. They also went into timber and lumber harvesting. So they went to harvest in forests using Chinese-owned sawmills. So as they develop your country, the infrastructure, they go ahead and harvest the lumber and make sure that they're supplying China with lumber. So that's common in Liberia, Equatorial Guinea, Mozambique, and others. They did the same for copper and iron in Zambia and Gabon. They did the same for minerals in Ghana, Botswana, South Africa, Nigeria, etc. Such that now all over they are acquiring resources pegged to the infrastructural development that they are doing. Okay. So that's kind of what has happened in the 90s. Of course, as you can see now, what's going on is that they're moving in and acquiring resources and creating a market. Their focus is to have a large market in Africa. That differs slightly from how Western ideas, if you like, invest in Africa. They do development to help Africans develop. These ones are also, is more of a give and take relationship. So that's what we see as their policy in the 90s.
Thank you, Dr. Nyambane. It sounds like there were some drastic differences that you noted between the relationship of the past in the 1970s, where there was this mutual benefit and friendship, to the 1990s and beyond, where it sounds like China utilized some of the resources in Africa to benefit themselves, and took advantage of some of the market that was available to them there. And you've left us with the possible question that maybe this wasn't as mutually beneficiary as it once was, or beneficial as it once was. Dr. Monson, what are your thoughts regarding the relationship from the 1970s to the 1990s and current? Dr. Monson, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Nyambane. I think there were really major transformations economically, and I think it's important to recognize that both African economies and the Chinese economy rather, underwent economic liberalization around the same time. And I think that's interesting because we talked before about how the 1960s was a moment of sort of recognition of some shared interest. And I think that unfortunately, some of the structural adjustment programs and economic and pressures for economic liberalization that accompanied lending as conditionalities on lending, especially from Western donors, this put African economies in a really tough situation. And again, you know, there was a lot of deregulation, a real push to move government out of things like subsidies for school, for health, for things that had been really important to post-colonial governments in several instances were not seen as having economic efficiencies. So a lot of government subsidies were pulled out, for example, of agriculture. So I think it's important to recognize where the African economies were, and kind of generally, and then China definitely had an interest. And there were, I think, two things that really characterized China's 1990s activities in Africa. I think one was the scale. There was a very different scale of investment than African governments had encountered before, and also a lot of speed. So I think there was just a real acceleration, and I think it's taken some time. And now I think African governments are in a much better position. I think, Leslie, you asked the question about sort of equal partners. You know, there's a real inequality or a disparity between the kind of wealth of a state of the size of China, but also of the potential sectors of investment. So one of the things, for example, that happened with infrastructure was that China, after liberalizing their economy, the state invested a lot in infrastructure development. And that, some economists argue, became kind of an overheated sector, if you will. There was a lot of potential for infrastructure development. Then those companies were both government and non-government companies, part private and part public. They could then go to Africa and find a place where they could continue to have contracts for their infrastructure projects. I think the question of debt is one that's really on the agenda right now. How will these projects be paid for? And I can say more about that later, but let me go to the people-to-people part, because I think that in the, you know, people look back at the 70s and they'll say, well, the Chinese stayed in their compounds. You know, they didn't mingle with the people, but the people-to-people emphasis in the 70s and the 60s was very much one that emphasized mutual learning and I would say mutual respect. Those railway workers that I've interviewed that went to build Tazara, they had to do a lot of homework, and they had principles that they had to follow in terms of how they interacted with people. Today, a lot of the people that are going to run companies and run programs and projects don't have that kind of. They're not. Many of them don't have that kind of focus or expertise or interest. So I think that the people-to-people relationships have shown a lot more tension and a lot more friction. And I think that's something that Justin might also have noticed and can talk about. So I think there are really, really big differences. But I think the main change in the 90s was because of the economic liberalization and then just the scale and speed with which China became interested in Africa.
Thank you to both of you. Justin, I'm more than happy to yield the floor to you now, or we can come back to you. I think my fifth question also has to do with the relationship of people, but I'm happy to yield the floor to you now if you have something to say.
In all honesty, I think I can maybe wait for the fifth question. Should be fine. I think I can loop it back around to that.
Sure. Okay. No problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to remind everyone that who's listening right now, you're more than welcome to put questions that you may have in the chat. And as I'm saying this, it looks like we've got a question that came in. And that question is this partnership working efficiently alone, or is it in the future to tie in more investors to the economy in Africa? And so I'm wondering, with the idea of this question, it sounds like in regards to our panelists, maybe the idea of China working in it by itself as a country investing in the continent of Africa. Is there a future to tie in other countries to invest and maybe invest in a different way, as you're explaining that some of the ways that China is investing can be questionable in terms of the sustainability of that relationship for mutual benefit to the continent?
May I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
So that question is a very good question, and it speaks to the bigger concern that is being voiced, that this partnership seems predatory. It seems like the China is slowly coming in and taking over the resources and strategic facilities in Africa. An example in point is the port in Zambia, which had been given as collateral and now is owned by China. I can also give you an example from Kenya. The port of Mombasa is the collateral for a railway that has just been recently been built. So among circles in Africa, there are talks on the approach that China uses of giving subsidized loans for development and actually doing the development themselves and using their own labor. Therefore, they make their bidding for any government project. No other competitor can actually underbid them. So in that sense, it appears like it's a competitive market process because you are giving to the lowest bidder, but this lowest bidder is actually being assisted by the government or the Chinese government. So that conversation is going there. So in that sense, it's not efficient, if you like, if you're looking at both partners going in the best interest possible. So while African countries are taking this, and there's rumbling both from the West and within some African countries, China is also making moves to counter that. Okay, first, I don't have proof of this, but there are articles that have been written in the media that it encourages corrupt leaders to be sustained in office so that this practice can go on. Okay. And it discourages transparency. So in that case, that particular relationship is not efficient.
Thank you, Dr. Nyambane, for answering that question. Dr. Monson or Mr. Leggs, did you have any additional comments that you wanted to add? Dr. Monson, you're muted.
So I think I might just add and say a couple things. One is, it's a wonderful question, and I think the question of partnership is a really good one. I think that so Africa is very diverse. It's not a single country. And within African countries, there are many diverse interests. And I think what Dr. Nyambane is reminding us of is that within an African country, there are political interests. So there might be a ruling party. We see this in Uganda with President Museveni, where an alliance or where relationships with external powers like China could be used by parties for their own advantage. So I think it's important to think about this these partnerships in ways that let us really see the diversity of different places and different interests. At the same time, I think that this issue of scale and speed is really important to keep in mind, and it can go in both directions. So if China, for example, is now trying to move away within its own domestic economy, away from producing, just being a commodity producer, sort of the factory of the world, and to build a domestic economy that's more diversified and more robust. They've also developed an interest in international finance, because international investment in finance, so not building the railway, but giving the funding to build the railway and earning interest on the repayment of debt. So as China's economy diversifies and shifts, that's going to impact the African countries as well. And I think that's where the disparities of scale can be really significant. African economies China plays a much bigger role in African economies as a partner than African economies play in China's global economic picture. Africa plays a very, very small role in Africa's larger economy. So the African economies, the African governments do need to be thoughtful and look to this sustainability question, look to this question of partnership, come to the table and negotiate for partnerships that give them more of a voice, because they are more vulnerable in this situation. They could be depending on China to buy oil. Well, China's moving to other oil suppliers right now. So the old idea that all of Africa's resources are going to China isn't really going to be, maybe that's not what's going to happen. In fact, that's not what's happening right now. So then, you know, China's able to be mobile with its capital investments, and African countries need to be negotiating and working with China so that they diversify their partnerships and their portfolios. And then just lastly, I'd love to see the United States imagine African countries as partners, as trading partners, as investment opportunities, and not only as a place to send development assistance.
Thank you, Dr. Monson. We've had a couple of questions come in the chat. You guys are getting the audience thinking here. So Erica asks, how might the African Union shape future collaborations with China? Or will relations continue to develop bilaterally? And though you did touch on that a bit, Dr. Monson, I wonder if any of our panelists want to explore that question a little bit more.
The African Union already is in China's corner. Okay, in 2000, China organized what they called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and 40 heads of states attended out of the 52. Out of that, they agreed that they are going to be partnering. So some of the things that came out of that, China helped and financed the building of the Organization of African Union headquarters in Ethiopia. So already the OAU is completely in cahoots with China. So it's not going to stand aside as one bloc to try and even come in between what China is doing with each individual country.
I think I would just add on to that, that I do think that moving away from bilateral agreements is great. I think there are some examples of regional economic cooperation in Africa, like the SADC region, for example, that demonstrate that creating more scale on the African side in terms of regional cooperation can be strong. I think the AU can be unwieldy at times, and so I think but I think that across regions and across sectors, now we have the African Free Trade Zone. I think it's going to be very interesting to see to what degree that strengthens networks and economic cooperation among African countries. I think just for far too long, African countries have been forced into bilateral or mediated relationships. For example, even if you look at infrastructure, you want to fly across Africa. Sometimes it's still easier to fly to Europe first and then back to the continent. It's time. It's time for Africa to get this robust, interconnected economic cooperation, and it could be that having a strong, large power like China could be providing some push towards those efforts.
So Jamie, your comments lead us right into another question that was posed, and you're saying that China could be that push to move Africa. But the question is that came in through the chat is, should we be concerned that China will take over the continent of Africa? So we've been in discussion about the ways that China has invested, but some of that language has been a bit strong, right? And the idea that investment comes at a pretty high cost for certain countries and resources that are available in those countries. And so this question that's been posed is, should we have concern as global citizens that there is this idea of China taking over the entire continent?
Well, I think that the things I've already said give some specific examples of areas that are important for us to be, and I should say not for me, but as much as really for African governments and African citizens to be paying attention to. I do find that some of the rhetoric that comes around in the media portrays Africans sometimes as not having a lot of agency, that they're kind of victims, or that African governments are naive in some way, or that African citizens, and I really don't think that's the case. I do believe that if you look at the evidence, that African governments and African actors are playing an active role, and that can be strengthened. And on the other side, maybe I'll just leave it there. But I do think that I want to be cautious about a stereotype that Africa is just a passive victim, that Africa is not an actor. Africans are actors, and they're incredibly resilient in so many situations over history. And they've been African people have been engaged globally in all kinds of ways. They weren't just an isolated, static continent historically. And so I just want to make sure we don't fall into stereotypes, and we see the strengths and the potential, especially with young people coming up now, and lots of positive energy in African countries. I really feel more optimistic. That's what I'll say.
If I may, first of all, I appreciate that response, Dr. Monson, because that's really true. The the African leaders are actually active participants in this relationship, even one-sided as it may look. Mm-hmm. The main motivation is that China does not bring in political interference. It does not try to say, here you need to do this in order to get the aid. Your leaders need to be transparent. You need to have democracy. It doesn't bring those conditionalities like the West would bring if they were giving aid. So in that sense, African leaders are choosing China actively because their aid comes without conditionalities. So in that sense, it's really a partnership of the willing. They are willing to be in this partnership.
Thank you both for answering that question, and I appreciate the lens that both of you gave us in response to that question. There is another question that came into the chat. Our audience is leaning in now. And so this question is a bit longer, so give me a moment as I read through it. The exploitation of Africa's resources has a long history. Is there discussion with world leaders to help African nations retain the benefits of its resources? What initiatives exist to help Africa develop economically? How can U.S. citizens help inform this discussion and perhaps put political pressure on our own political figures to help Africa develop its economy in ways that enhance its progress rather than exploit its resources? So that's a bit wordy. And I think some of the things that are being asked in this question have been answered in various ways. But please, if there is a piece of that question that you would like to tackle and answer for our listeners, by all means. Dr. Nyambane, I see that you are unmuted. Did you have a few things to share in regards to that question?
Yes, I will share, although I keep my mute button on because I struggle finding it, so I leave it alone. Yeah, the two approaches from China and say the US or Western countries towards development in Africa is different. The approach is this. China is looking at Africa as a market. They are looking at all these Africans who actually have resources and they're looking for a market for their goods. The West, including the US, are looking at Africa as poor countries that just need help. We just need to give them development aid and then therefore they develop. So it needs a complete reorientation of the thinking rather than even think of going to help in terms of development aid. One thing that can really help is open the US to African products so that Africans can sell their products here, find ways that American products can be affordable in America. One reason that China is able to penetrate the market of Africa is because they make their products affordable in Africa. I can assure you that Western products, especially products from America, are superior or at least viewed to be superior in quality. So if they could be affordable, they would survive that market by themselves. We would not need any government, additional foreign government to intervene.
Wow, that's really interesting that you say that, Dr. Nyambane. I remember the cost of peanut butter when I went to Kenya, and it was ridiculous to try to get a US name brand peanut butter. Forget it. Forget it. I would have spent my day's allowance trying to get some peanut butter. So I completely agree with that statement regarding making things affordable in terms of looking at the continent as a marketplace versus a place to donate to help. So I appreciate that lens. Thank you. And I can attest to that affordability statement for sure. And we are coming close to our time here. And so I want to open up one more question. And Mr. Legs, I'm posing it to you in particular, but it's very much so open to the rest of our panelists as well. This question is in regards to the physical presence of China. We've talked a lot about the financial presence of China on the continent of Africa, but I want to talk about the physical presence. And in the documentary, Dr. Monson explores the friendships that were built between the Chinese and the African workers, and she alluded to that a little bit in discussion earlier. While the governmental systems of the African Union and China seem to have a complicated relationship, but a relationship nonetheless, those with feet on the ground seem to have figured out how to coexist. China does not only have a financial presence in Africa, but visiting various countries, you see Chinese people. What can we make of the physical presence of the Chinese in various countries across Africa, both past and present day? And Mr. Leggs, I know that you noticed this, particularly, I believe, in Rwanda when you were visiting Rwanda. So if you can speak to that connection, that physical connection and relationship that's being created on the ground.
Yes, absolutely. So in my time in Rwanda, I actually stayed in a Chinese hotel, Chinese-owned hotel, and spent a little time getting to know a lot of the different people there, from the Rwandan workers who were speaking to me and teaching me Kinyarwanda and also speaking French, to the Chinese guests that happened to be spending their time there. I actually spent a little time with somebody out on the, it was upstairs on the top of the roof while we were looking at the sunset together through the mountains. It was really beautiful. And we just kind of discussed the nature of our experiences here and why we were here and what we were doing. And he was there for work, and so was I. But in that moment, we had kind of let go of some of that focus. But I asked him why he specifically chose this hotel. It was because of the fact that it was Chinese owned. He understood that, well, this is a place that is almost made specifically for me within this area. But even with that happening, the kindness and the love and support that came out from like any of the people in Rwanda while I was there was clearly obvious and well known. But I think more on point actually is from an experience I had while I was in Zambia. I was staying at a hotel with Dr. Monson actually, and we had spent some time at the bar, and we were getting to know some of the people in the general area. And I spoke with this young woman, and she was telling me about her experiences, and we were telling her a little bit about the documentary. When that came out, we discussed China a little bit, and she mentioned that she actually worked in a building that had Chinese workers in it. And the workers, she felt like they were very closed off, as though she couldn't actually approach them. Not that they were unapproachable, but that they really kept to themselves. And if there's anything that I had learned in my experiences while in Africa, it's that the people there are incredibly intelligent, incredibly capable, and hardworking. So I told her that like maybe she should learn just a little bit of Chinese. Maybe like there's definitely different languages that are spoken in China. But if she could learn just a little bit of that, reach out to the other side of the aisle, that might work. And that you might actually have an opportunity to see that there's a connection there. One that wasn't really obvious or readily available to them, but the only reason that I even spoke to the man on the rooftop was because that I had been learning a little bit of Chinese, and I said something to him, and he looked back at me, and he said, "You speak Chinese?" And I explained to him that I was still trying to figure it out, but just that one little bit of effort, that show and proof that there is an engagement personally builds this opportunity for growth and development. And I know it's important that we focus on the forest and recognize everything that is so readily like important on a global scale. But we can't forget that the forest is made up of trees individually. We have to kind of note that and recognize that and engage that too.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Leggs. I appreciate that. That's my takeaway. Make sure you notice the trees, right, while you're in the midst of the forest. Wonderful. Thank you. As we come to a close, we just have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that I, one, thank the panel for their time, but I also want to let our listeners know that Dr. Monson has been extremely generous in allowing our students to actually have access to the documentary that we've been discussing today. So please be on the lookout in Canvas. You will have an opportunity to actually watch the documentary that we have been alluding to. And I will tell you, it's amazing. And it shares very personal stories and personal insight, both on from the lens of Africa, but also from the lens of China. And so there is this connection and this bridge to both of these worlds. And as Mr. Legs said, you get to see some of those trees that create the forest. So I would like to give just a moment to our panel to give just 60 seconds of closing statements while we have our listeners still. Dr. Nyambane, if you would like to start, 60 seconds of closing.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Monson, and thank you, Lex, and you, Leslie, for this opportunity. It has been wonderful sharing the stage with you all.
Thank you, Dr. Monson. Mr. Legs.
Thank you, Dr. Nyambane, and thank you, Dr. Monson. It has been a pleasure being on this panel with you, truly an honor. And thank you, Ms. Neal, for putting this together so that we could all speak on the topic that is so important to us.
Thank you. Earlier I said thank you to Dr. Monson and she had not spoken yet. Thank you, Dr. Nyambane. I apologize. Dr. Monson, would you share?
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And it's only an hour and a very big and very important topic. So I hope everyone keeps learning and do have, if you can, have a chance to take a look at the video. And it's been wonderful to be with you all today. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you all for joining us today. There will be a recording available, so please be on the lookout for the recording of today's session. It will be available on the Montcalm website. Again, I appreciate our panelists. Thank you to our IT department for helping us to run so smoothly. And thank you to the World Affairs Council for prompting us to be able to complete this panel this afternoon. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.